Well, in this COVID season, one of the toughest things that my wife and I has had to adjust is our 3-year-old Cooper's sleeping habits. Here's a picture of her, just a reminder of how spirited she is. She could have her own reality TV show. Well, in the beginning of COVID, she started out in her crib where we had a princess net, which is a nice way of saying that she was in a cage, but then she was able to Shawshank her way out of the net, out of the crib, and crawl into our bed, which for a parent is like one of the saddest days, because now she's in a big girl bed. No crib, no net, nothing to stop her. So it's safe to say that she's now gets in our bed for the past, every day, 6 days a week. And man, have we tried everything from privileges to rewards to punishment. I still wake up with her feet in my back. Emily and I have hit what I call the wall of doubt. It's the thought in the moment where you feel like nothing is ever going to change. Emily and I almost feel hopeless that Cooper will be sleeping in our bed till she's 16 years old. Do you ever have those things in your life where you just think, this is never going to change? No matter how hard you try, what strategies and adjustments you try to make, it just feels like it will never get better. Maybe it's your marriage, that you're having a communication problem, or your kids, or your in-law problem, or you're single and you're trying to do well in your career and friendships. You have a desire to find someone to date and be with, but just feels like nothing will change. Maybe it's your finances that you're struggling with, or you're trying to get in shape. We all have those areas in our lives that it doesn't seem like things will change. What I've realized is that no matter the situation, that the negative emotion and the negative self-talk never is the solution to the problem that you're in. That my emotion of anger and frustration towards Cooper, my daughter, isn't making her sleep in her own bed. In fact, your reaction and emotion to life's never gonna change problems is key to the quality of life you will have. It's a decision each day to bring health in your internal world that will make the difference to the quality of life you'll have, no matter the external problems that you will face. The health of your internal world will determine the impact the external world makes in our lives. It reminds me of the illustration of the 2 soda cans. When you look at the cans, they look exactly the same. They look wonderful, delicious, but when I press against both of them, one begins to get crushed while the other doesn't. It's because one has been punctured and there's nothing in it, while the other is full. When the external parts of our lives and our problems apply pressure, when we've hit the wall of doubt, when there's an obstacle, when we find ourselves in a battle, the impact of the external will either begin to crush you, or you'll be able to remain stable, confident, strong, courageous, because of the inner work that you've been intentional about. The stronger our internal world is, the less destructive the external parts of our world will have on us. So, what is our vision? What is the hope in our inner world? What are we aiming for? I love what Alcohol Anonymous Big Book says about the kind of healthy life that we strive for. It says this: if we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we'll be amazed before we are even halfway through. We're going to know new freedom and have new happiness. We will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how experience can benefit others. That feeling of uselessness or self-pity will begin to disappear. We will lose interest in our selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. Our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Fear of people and economic insecurity will leave us. We will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Are these extravagant promises? We think not. They are being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly and sometimes slowly. They will always materialize if we work for them. If we can do the work of our inner life, the life that God desires for us, we will begin to show up. It will begin to materialize within us. The Bible has all kinds of promises as well, to have life and life to the full. And Isaiah says, you will keep in perfect peace Those minds are steadfast because you trust in the Lord. Or Jesus says this promise, come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Or Paul says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. These are incredible promises, but when the wall of doubt shows up and we don't think these promises are attainable, we typically neglect our internal world and no longer remain strong and courageous. It reminds me a lot of the story that we're going to be talking about today. In Joshua chapter 6 and the Battle of Jericho. And this is set up real quick, a little backstory. We have the Israelites, which are God's chosen people. They were in slavery for many years. Then God chose Moses to lead the people, lead the charge, and free the Israelites from slavery into a land that God has promised them. They wandered around for 40 years, then Moses dies. Then God raises up somebody within the ranks, Joshua, to go into the promised land. As they make their way to this land that God has promised them, they come across the first city they have to overcome, Jericho. Now, Jericho is not a big city. In fact, it's about an hour walk around the city, so not a big city at all. But what stood in their way, what stood away from the promise, was the size of the wall. See, God has promised this land, but they didn't have possession of the land yet because of this wall. I believe God also has promised us to have life and life to the full, where joy is possible, being patient in all things can happen. Finding rest and peace in the midst of chaos is a promise that God wants to give you, but you have not possessed it yet. Just because something is promised doesn't mean you have possession. Like in parenting, we'll say, if you eat all your food on the plate, I promise you I'll give you dessert. Just because I've promised the dessert doesn't mean they have possession of the dessert. And what stood in the way of the Israelites to the promised land? A wall. What stands in the way of the promises that God has for you is a wall. The wall of doubt. Those moments which you think will never change. Israelites and us think that this wall is just too big. So what do we do when we run into the wall? Well, 3 things for today. The first is that perspective needs to change. In Joshua and the Israelites, in Joshua 6, it says, now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went in, no one went out. The walls are so big and they're so secure that no one was able to go in. But then Lord says to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its kings and its fighting men. God uses the word have delivered. God's like, no, I already got this. He can use past tense because he's above time. He's above circumstances. He already sees the ending. He has a different perspective. We spend all week looking at our obstacles, our problems, our struggle, our pain, the past, the wall. But he's telling us, instead of looking at the wall, look at me. I know it's big. I know it's daunting, but I am bigger. In my life personally, what he does is he's been sending people to talk to about my problems. And they give me amazing perspective of what I'm going through. I'm actually hooked right now on this app called Marco Polo, where you leave these video recordings of yourself just talking and you give it to a friend and family. And I love it because I'm horrible at texting, I'm horrible at calling people back, and this is a very casual way of just sharing my issues, my walls with other people. And what's happening over and over again is that God is using them and their perspective of the wall I'm staring at and giving me hope. Is give me the tools in my belt that when I'm stuck in my anger and frustration or despair, they look at the same wall of doubt and they give me that hope, give me that peace, give me that rest I need. Some of you, you've got to find a way to get a different perspective of the wall that's causing you so much anger and pain. And then what happens is that sometimes instead of calling somebody or Marco Poloing, if that's a word, when my emotions are too hot, when I don't know what to do, I just think of what a strong, healthy, courageous person would do in my shoes. And I just ask that question. What would a strong and courageous person do? And even when I don't feel very strong and courageous, when I ask that question, I typically will begin to do what a strong and courageous person does. The wall wasn't big as I thought. The promise of God's peace and rest and strength actually begins to materialize in my life, and I become a possession of those promises. So what do you do when you run into a wall? The first, perspective needs to change. Secondly, progress, not perfection. Back to the Battle of Jericho, okay? God gives them clear instructions. They didn't know how to take down the wall, so they listened to the one who already saw the wall fall. And this is what they did. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord, blowing its trumpets. The armed men went behind them or in the rear to guard the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets kept on sounding. So on the second day, they marched around the city and returned to camp. They did this for 6 days. This is what I like to call first thought problems. We typically act on our first thought towards a person or conflict when our first thought is never our best thought. Because the men in this army, their first thought had to be, what in the world are we doing? Joshua has lost his mind. Nowhere in the history of the world has an army ever defeated another army by blowing trumpets and walking around the city. But what's amazing in God's kingdom, that even though all they did was march once around Jericho, they were making progress, even when they couldn't see it. The best thing you could do this week, and something that a strong and courageous person does, is work on their first thought problem. What if, come on, every time you have a thought this week, you pause, you ask God to enter in your thoughts, you ask the question, what would a strong and person do? And do that. Don't you think your inner life would get stronger? Don't you think you get more confident in your decisions and how to tackle conflict in your life if you didn't have to go on your first thought every single time? I'm telling you, I know that it feels like you're not making any progress on actually being strong and courageous, but you absolutely are. You might not sense you're getting the promises of God, but you absolutely are. You're not going to be perfect each time, but it's not about perfection, it's about progress. In Western culture, when we see a problem, what we typically do is attack the problem straight on, solve it immediately, and then move past it as fast as we can. But in Eastern culture, they like to circle the problem over and over again, seeing all the sides, looking at all the solutions and ways out. Once they circle it enough, then they make the best decision. I just wonder, if God wanted the Israelites to walk around the city so they wouldn't be afraid, that the walls weren't as big and daunting like they thought. Their walking wasn't a waste of time, it was progress. Your walking and working on your emotional, mental, spiritual life, it is making progress. Kenneth Coke, a famous American poet, he once said, "You aren't just the age you are, you're all the ages you've ever been." Meaning, the progress you've been making, it's taking your whole life, and although not perfect, still progress. I had a friend recently take some time away and go in the mountains. He told me that while he was up there, he's just not doing anything. But I told him, you are doing something. You're getting strong and courageous in your internal world because you are disconnecting and engaging with God's creation. He was in possession of the promise of rest. So, what do you do when you run into a wall? Perspective needs to change. Progress, not perfection. Perseverance is key. All strong and courageous and healthy, incredibly solid inner world people I know, they all persevere. I also know what's true of God. In order to be strong and courageous internally, you'll have to do something you've never done before. Walking around the city has never been any great general's plan, but for God, it is. So on the 7th day, they get up at the daybreak and march around the city 7 times in the same manner, except on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord." When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and the sound of the trumpet and the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. I was listening to a sermon this week about this story, and the pastor said, don't stop on 6. It is so easy to stop when you've been marching for 6 days and nothing has happened. But it's always the last day, the last lap, the final push that changes everything. The Israelites not stopping led them to victory and one step closer to the land that God has promised them. In a workout recently, the instructor told us to do the same workout 3 times because the first time, your muscles are just getting used to the new move. The second time, you're getting the strength to do that move once again. It's that 3rd time where you're actually going to see the results. It's not just the strength that is going in that muscle, but it's impacting your entire body. A personal trainer here at the Crossing told me that it's all about the intensity of a movement. The greater the intensity you have pulling off that movement, the greater the results. 6 days of marching is like training camp. It's like building a habit. But on the 7th day, that is where victory will be. The intensity of the trumpets, the shouting of the men, all cause the wall to fall down. Do not stop on 6. What would a strong and courageous person do? They never stop when they don't see the results. They never stop when things are just too hard. They don't stop on 6. I love what the Hebrew writer says about this. He tells us, you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you'll receive what He has promised you. I want to give you that same challenge, persevere, so that when you do the will of God, you'll receive what He has promised you. The Israelites had to do what God asked them to do, otherwise they'd never have been given what God has promised them. I desperately want you to receive God's promises in your life, but it starts with your persevering through the wall of doubt and doing the will of God, even when it doesn't make sense and even when you've never done something before. So this week, what would a strong and courageous person do? If you're struggling with addiction or shame or past hurts, a strong and courageous person, they'll go to a 12-step program like Celebrate Recovery, AA, NA. If you're dealing with consistent anger and anxiety to the point where people are pointing it out and it's affecting the world around you, a strong and courageous person would seek some sort of counseling. Call the church this week, talk to one of our pastors, or we can refer you to somebody else. If you feel a little lonely, depression's kicked in, you're isolated, a strong and courageous person would give small groups a shot to be transparent, open, to have other people encourage you. As a parent, your role is to look at your kids' emotions, to step it up for them, because a strong and courageous parent, they help their kids get involved in student ministry on a Wednesday night. They help manage their screen time. They protect them from toxic relationships. There's this close married friend of mine who had just been through it. Their marriage has been up and down. They've been through so much. They have 4 kids, long working hours didn't help. But then they came to a point where they both did something that they never have done before. They trusted God and let go. They let go of their pride, their ego, stopped being right. They submitted to God, which then led them to submit to one another. And then came breakthrough after breakthrough. The negative thoughts they had of themselves individually began to disappear. And how they saw of each other as husband and wife, they were all in. Unconditional, no matter what, ride or die, all the way to the end kind of marriage. Through all the tough times, they let God lead. And now they're in the process of actually fostering another kid. They had friends and counselors change their perspective. They let Jesus into their lives and into their marriage every day. Progress, not perfection. They did not stop on 6. They persevered. A great place to start is just talking to your Heavenly Father. Today, maybe it's just praying and talking to Him about what's happening in your life, letting Him do a major work in you. That's what a strong and courageous person would do.